Welcome, 3 p.m. on Friday, and this is the UTH Fantasy Football Expert Chat powered by Slurv.com. Second week in a row, going to be here throughout the NFL season, taking your questions, answering. You can listen into any of these conversations week in and week out, live or recorded, and you can also submit questions on the Slurv.com tailgate. And all those questions. With me this week is Adam Harstad, and we're going to get to some dynasty, some redraft, in general, fantasy football and NFL discussion. Also want to mention these chats are available for every sport and a great group of experts from across the industry. Names like Evan Silva, Davis Maddock, Adam Levitan, and Chris Raybon are going to be on at 4 p.m. following this show. And you can also catch someone like FanDuel's 2015 Fantasy Football World Champ, Roman Edmond, and many more names. So go check out the schedule for all of these chats. And Adam, the two of us have been at Football Guys. We were talking before the recording for about 3 years now together, both of us doing some things in Dynasty, and you're expanding your brand and your footprint there at the site. And we really haven't talked much for being two of the, I would say, top, 500 names in the Dynasty quote-unquote expert space every day, right? But we just discussed, both of us in 2016, we are now full-time in whatever that means on a daily, weekly basis, but both of us are full-time fantasy football worker bees in a lot of ways. So welcome, and at Adam Harstad on Twitter, myself at Chad Parsons NFL. You can always find us there for discussions between episodes and between all the projects we're doing. But welcome. And what are some of the projects you have working at Football Guys and beyond for the 2016 season?
Thanks, Chad. So like you said, we've mostly been Dynasty for the most part. I quit real, actual being a productive member of society when my son was born 3 years ago. And so he's entering school full time. So right now I'm doing basically whatever needs to be done. Anytime anybody asks anything, I say, yeah, sure, let's do that. So I've been doing some Dynasty. For the past couple years, I've been doing player upside projections, which is if everything breaks right for this player, what is the 90th percentile that we could expect him to hit realistically. I'm doing punt and kickoff returner projections this year, so get hype about that. I know we've got a lot of punt and kickoff leagues out there coming out of the shadows. And then just because I'm a masochist, I decided to start up a podcast this year too. So that's Fantasy Football in Theory. That's on iTunes and Stitcher right now.
Great. And I host the Under the Helmet Weekly podcast, and UTHDynasty.com is my Dynasty baby, so you can get a FanDuel promotion with FanDuel.com/UnderTheHelmet to get a free General Manager subscription for the next 12 months and all of the audio content for Dynasty you could possibly desire. And the two of us, we're going to hit Dynasty, we're going to hit Redraft, everything in between. And I wanted to start because you're doing kickoff and punt returns. What do you think about the new rules coming out now with the touchbacks coming out to the 25? There's been a lot of discussion on what push-pull impact strategies we're going to see from NFL teams. From the preseason, I know that may not be the best litmus test, but it's all we have so far. In terms of you projecting opportunities, I'll say, do you think it's going to go the way of NFL teams trying to pin and force returns to get them inside of the 25, or are we going to see the booming through the end zone touchbacks as we've seen in recent years?
Well, so far through preseason, touchbacks are actually up a tick, or not touchbacks, returns are actually up a tick from where they were at this point last year. And you do see more teams kicking shorter, but it's really hard to draw too much conclusion from preseason because coaches usually tell their returners, I don't care if it's deep, go ahead and return it because we want to evaluate how you do as a returner. If we get pinned at the 18, I don't care, that's fine. And during the regular season, coaches start caring. So just because the trend is there right now in preseason, I'm not sure it's going to hold up in the regular season. So far, what I've done for my own personal projections is I've ignored the rule until I can start to see what sort of impact it's actually having, because I could see it going either way. I could see getting more and shorter returns. I could see getting fewer and longer returns. I could see things more or less staying the same, and this was all much ado about nothing. But I tend to be pretty fundamentally conservative, and I like to say I'm a Bayesian, so I stick to my priors as much as possible. Um, so I'm waiting for evidence, just like everybody else is.
Inertia. So,
Absolutely.
so as an NFL team, though, what would be your, figuring this game out strategically? Would it be based on the level of your kicker, the comfortable of trying to get it inside, say, the 5 yard line, or 1 or 2 yards deep to really make it, where they're going to bring it out, you're going to have a good chance to cover and gain 5, maybe even 10 yards on a consistent basis. Would that be your go-to strategy, or would you be, let's not risk a return and let's force touchbacks as we've done in the past?
I think in large part it would depend on how much confidence I had in my offense. And if I had a bad offense and I knew points were going to be at a premium, I'd probably try and pin them a little bit deeper, because then getting the extra 4 or 5 yards on every drive, that's really important. But it's a higher variance play, because more things can go wrong. You kick it out of bounds, or they catch it at the 4 and they get a 30-yard return and you just gave up yards. So if I had a good offense, I wouldn't really play that game. I'd just boot it through the end zone as much as possible.
I was almost thinking, as a returner, I always watch these good offenses, and I almost hope that they take touchbacks, because so many times we see penalties, a bad block, a hold, and you open that all up by actually returning it. So you take the touchback, where you're getting the ball. But now I think that could be critical, because you return it out to the 15 plus a penalty, half the distance. I mean, you're basically pinning yourself like a punt in a lot of ways, and those extra yards for a good offense coming out to the 25. I mean, I don't know what the expected points differential between starting at the 20 and the 25, but that 5 yards, a lot of these offenses get to midfield, and it kind of comes down to one first down or not on if they're going to get a field goal crack or not.
Yep.
Okay. In general, I like to kind of start out talking about some running backs and backfields, because I feel like that might be the biggest data points we get in terms of the pecking order in the preseason. Or running back is just sort of a natural position to scout and a natural position to watch and get that sample size. With wide receivers, a lot of more moving pieces. Let's start with Seattle. So we got their tune-up last night, and now we have 3 games worth of data points. Thomas Rawls, haven't seen him yet, returning from injury. Christine Michael has been a reclamation project. He was on the fringe for most of last year, bouncing around. We know the talent kind of dates back, but a lot of other questions. So, and I know you're one that we haven't got into this yet, but you're one that likes to sort of maximize allocation of talent when it becomes a distressed asset.
Right.
So my question would be, is Christine Michael, as he was a falling knife from probably a top 50 dynasty asset at points, even without a starting job, going all the way to the point where a lot of people were dropping him, and now he's back. So were you one that you accumulated shares this offseason, and kind of what do you see from Seattle? And now we got C.J. Prosise coming into the mix with his debut.
I'm a big fan of draft capital, and I think NFL teams are really, really good at what they do. They're better at what they do than I am. So anytime I can just cheat off of their homework, I love to do so. And Christine Michael being a second-round pick coming in, that tells me, the team obviously thought he was good. They thought there was a lot of talent there, and I think
a second-round pick, right, with all the injuries and sort of the knucklehead factor that I'm sure NFL teams knew.
Right, and I think we've seen the talent. We've seen, a lot of the failure to produce to this point hasn't been a lack of talent. It's been a lack of everything else. And
so when a player with pedigree comes back and they get more and more chances, which is to be expected, so that doesn't surprise you, right? I mean, your last dynasty roster spot, Christine Michael, sort of fits with your game plan.
Yeah, and you look at examples like Thomas Jones, Cedric Benson. Thomas Jones was for a good stretch of time with the Bears and the Jets, he was one of the most productive. He's probably one of the 5 most productive running backs in the NFL. And it's easy to lose sight of. Before that, he was like a complete non-entity in Arizona, and he played pretty well in Tampa Bay, but he couldn't get on the field. He was stuck behind Michael Pittman. But the thing about Thomas Jones is he was, I believe, a top 5 NFL draft pick, and so he kept getting those chances over and over and over again, and finally he stuck one. And then
Cedric Benson too, right? I mean,
yeah, Benson,
he was almost off the grid, and he ended up
sure.
having some starting caliber seasons.
Yeah, and it's funny because he did to Thomas Jones what Thomas Jones did to a lot of backs, because the Bears drafted Benson high in the first to replace Jones. And Jones just outplayed him. Jones outplayed him. Jones outplayed him. But eventually, the Bears are like, you know what, we're going to give Benson a shot anyway. And then he was decent with the Bears, and then he was actually pretty good with Cincinnati before he faded out. So somebody like Christine Michael, where he's got the draft pedigree and he's getting a lot of chances, I think that's why you invest in draft pedigree. It's not necessarily because they're better players, although a lot of times they are, but it's because, you know, if a 7th-round pick had the history that Michael had, he would have been out of the league.
He'd be 2 years into his new career, right?
Right, absolutely. He'd be selling cell phones at a kiosk in the local mall like Tatum Bell. Yeah. So it's not that surprising to see Michael making the comeback. At the same time, I don't think that he's usurped Rawls to this point. Just because we haven't seen enough from Rawls, and like I said, I tend to be pretty conservative.
Rawls has no draft pedigree, so let's combine that in Adam's head so Rawls played well for a stretch, didn't do much in the passing game, but now Michael, rounds and rounds more pedigree, and then they draft CJ Prosise on day 2. So how does this all kind of, this recipe there in Seattle, is it a muddled mess? Do you have a go-to value based on all the price points that we've seen thus far?
I still think Rawls is the guy to own there, and he does lack the pedigree, but he was really good, and moreover, you're seeing a lot of commitment from Seattle's front office. Although, you know, I say that they drafted Prosise, but adding Christine Michael is not really a knock on Thomas Rawls, because Christine Michael was free. You know, there's no reason not to add him.
And they added him back last year too. I mean, he was gone and then back because he's been with the team. He at least knows, well, whatever percentage he did know the offense, he knew that amount coming back.
Right, and it's not like, you know, drafting Prosise on the second day, that's potentially a knock on Rawls' value, or
well, he wasn't getting a lot of receiving work.
Right,
anyway,
I was about to say, perhaps an idea that they view him more as a 2-down back than a 3-down back, which in today's NFL, you can still have plenty of value that way. But adding Christine Michael, I'm not too worried about. To me, that's not an indicator that the front office is souring on Rawls. And so the front office keeps telling me that they view Rawls as the guy, and so I'm still inclined to believe them. To get on a more of a philosophical sidebar, I think the traditional way that people assess player value is they do projections, whether formal projections or just mental projections. You know, I think this guy's going to get, you know, a lot of yards. This guy's going to get this many points. Like, this is the path to production for this guy. And I always say that despite the fact that I actually do some projections too. In general, I tend to be more on team heuristics, which is just simple rules of thumb, looking for common trends. And to the extent that I do projections, I'm usually just trying to translate my heuristics into some sort of workable number. And so for me, from a dynasty standpoint, I can say that Christine Michael, CJ Prosise, and Thomas Rawls all have solid dynasty value. Now, what's the path for them all having fantasy relevance? I don't really know, but since I'm operating on rules of thumb, I don't need to know. I know that running backs, even undrafted running backs who look as good as Rawls did his rookie year, typically are going to have some value, and backs who are drafted on the second day like Prosise are typically going to have some value, and Michael's got the pedigree and he's looking good now, and he typically has some value. And Dynasty's kind of a long game, and there's a lot of variables that we don't anticipate coming. So maybe next year all 3 backs are starting on 3 different teams. We don't know. That's something that could happen. So I typically just say, rather than this is what I think how that's going to shake out, I look at, here's the profile of these 3 players, and here's historically about what that profile has been worth. And those are all 3 pretty valuable profiles, so I'm not really avoiding one of the 3, even if I don't really know how it's going to shake out.
I like the path you're going down though, because you're basically talking, I think, like a savvy dynasty owner and analyst, which is we don't do singular projections. We're
Mhm.
looking, it's a longer game, and it's more talent based than situational because a lot of things change through injury, through contracts, and so many variables to create pockets of extreme startability or avoiding them in season. And all three kind of pass, as you said, for various reasons, different litmus tests of viability going forward. And I kind of look at it, you said day two for CJ Procise. To me, it's almost like the floor of expectations is that's going to be a committee player, sort of a 50-50 in terms of maybe fantasy production, whether it's on the receiving side or the two down, touchdown, more dependent kind of grinder type. And then day three, I wanted to ask though, for day three, how much leash do you give these guys? Are those more situational plays in general because the allegiance through contract, through draft pedigree just isn't there? So are you looking more for initial bang for the buck, or do you still kind of side with there's some longer term talent holds from these little draft pedigree running backs specifically coming out of the draft process?
I tend to be. I think a lot of things relating to the NFL follow a power law distribution, which is, they start really high and then they drop off really quickly and then they have a long tail. And I think you look at star performers in the NFL, it's power law. You've got a couple just, Hall of Fame level talents, and then you've got maybe twice as many pretty solid multi-year starters, and then you've got twice as many guys who could be situational players, and then the further down you get, the bigger the group gets. And I do the same a lot in my fantasy valuations. They follow a pretty heavy power law distribution, which means the top guys
they're
are
almost worth so many of the
right.
mid-level guys. You can't literally make a balanced trade based on roster spots, right?
Right, exactly. And I a lot of people, as a dynasty analyst, I feel like this is kind of a taboo thing to say, but I don't really care that much about end of roster guys as much. I like having lottery tickets. I like throwing some of those darts and hoping they hit, but I don't really have so much preference between individual lottery tickets. I think it's just important that you have some. And a lot of that is, if you have my dynasty values and the most valuable player in dynasty, let's say Odell Beckham is worth 1,000 points of dynasty value. The drop between number 1 and number 5 might be 400 points.
Right.
The drop between number 50 and number 100 might be 20 points.
Right.
Like the gap between top players just dwarfs the gap between. So if I say, oh, this is my 50th ranked guy and this is my 100th ranked guy, those two might be closer in value to me than my number 1 and my number 2.
So are you constantly, is your overarching strategy, maybe not in the sprint of redraft in a sense, but overarching as an owner, it would be packaging assets together. When you have the opportunity, whether it's through distressment of an injury or suspension or just some of these things that can knock down whatever your talent baseline is for a player and create an opportunity to buy, that you'll get that player. And then let's worry about the 3 or 4 ancillary pieces you kind of built together into this formula where 3 plus 3 plus 2 plus 2 equals 10, and the other owner thinks they're filling out maybe these marginal, wide receiver 3, a flex spot, a running back 2, a draft pick, like all this kind of stuff, and you just say, well, I'll figure out a way to get more of those guys over the next 12 months because
Right.
I got the one guy that was previously very hard for me to pay, within the scope of roster building to get.
Yeah, and so if you look at like rookie draft picks, typically, and obviously things can vary from year to year, but by and large, after 18 rookie draft picks, I just don't really care that much anymore. I think the value between the guys going in the 20 to 24 range, those late second round guys, and the guys who are going to be available off the street after the draft, I just don't think it's that big of a difference. So I'll throw those things in like candy. I've got a trade and a guy's hemming and hawing, and I'm like, I'll throw you in like 3/3 and a second and a late second because I don't even care at that point. I feel like I can get guys who are almost as good off of waivers. Guys who have that similar lottery ticket type profile. And one of the things I like to do is I load up on lottery tickets, and if any of them become sort of a flavor of the moment, I'll trade that one and then just add another lottery ticket off the street. And I think you can keep accruing marginal gains that way without really sacrificing the makeup of your team.
Yeah, that's kind of the direction I was going with this discussion. I was going to say, how do you go from what's your take between flavor of the week, waiver wire, or say someone you drafted in the third, fourth round? So draft pedigree is probably low, perception is low, maybe opportunity value is the thing that's going in their direction, or if you hit, that's going to be what it is. So if something breaks their way in the preseason or the regular season, so do you have any examples of say the last year or two of your dynasty ownership and teams that where a player has gone from that perception on your valuation to closer to a core level asset where you haven't flipped them, or is it pretty much the rule is just when in doubt, the odds say they're not going to last for long? Very few examples, the Arian Fosters of the world, or heck, maybe even someone like Antonio Brown years ago qualifies, but they don't really get all the way, if you will, to being that long-standing asset.
Actually, I have an older example that I know off the top of my head because I gave it a lot when I was first articulating the theory. So I have a dynasty league where I traded Jordy Nelson and Donald Driver and Miles Austin and Austin Collie and Pierre Garçon, and I'm trading away all these guys, and I got like 4 second-round picks out of it. And on its face, you're like, wow, that is a terrible series of trades. But the thing is, the only reason I had the roster spot for Jordy Nelson in the first place is because I traded Donald Driver. And the only reason I had the roster spot for Miles Austin is because I traded Jordy Nelson. And then the only reason I had the roster spot for Pierre Garçon is because I traded, and so it's a chain where I'm just chaining that one roster spot. And so if you look at it that way, it's not like I traded the entire sequence of receivers for 4. It's that I traded the first receiver for 4 second-round draft picks, because if I hadn't traded him, I wouldn't have had the roster spot for the other ones.
Right.
So I think
people forget. I mean, you say Jordy Nelson, he was a long hold and a long developer in that Green Bay, right?
Yeah.
And probably Driver was on the downside
Absolutely.
of his arc there in Green Bay, but yeah, and you get 4 second-rounders. How many first-rounders can that turn into? Did you get at the end of the whole thing, did you end up with a blue chipper? Like, that's the whole giant pyramid of all the trades.
Yeah, absolutely. And also included in that list are the, Mike Sims Walker and Mike Wallace, who was good for a while, but I flipped him for, I think, a first, and I got good value out of a lot of assets. And the thing is, one of the big limiting factors on a dynasty team is roster spots. You can only roster so many players, and by turning these players into picks, you're also gaining these roster spots back. And
those picks don't lose value. I mean, that's the
Absolutely.
thing people forget. You basically hit the pause button of their valuation. Now, maybe, let's even rewind. Someone like Charles Johnson in season, right? He flashed up,
Sure.
had 4 to 6 weeks 2 years ago, but you flip him, I'm sure, like a Stephon Diggs, you probably could have extracted a first-round pick in the moment, and you say to yourself, what are the odds he perpetuates this? And I think one thing, and so you do a lot of projections and just sort of looking out and historical looking back. And I think people in general overestimate the consistent longevity factor, is how I'll say it, of these assets. As you said, it's a pyramid. The very top, these guys we throw out as outliers from the age curve perspective, or outliers from draft pedigree, outliers from, say, not missing games or not having the perceived, injury discount going on in the marketplace for them. All these things, that's really trying to shoot. I say shooting the needle is what I call it. Like, if you're betting against a lot of those factors and just, oh yeah, they're going to keep doing it over and over again until this age, or despite the fact that their contract says this, or despite the fact they were a 5th-round pick and they've done it for 3 games, or whatever it is, it just seems like eventually you're going to roll snake eyes because of that, I don't know, hubris, or that you think your valuation is the exception to the rules.
Yeah, and I say, I think one of the things I say the most is there's really no more overrated asset in Dynasty than a young wide receiver with upside. Because I get how excited it is to be about a young wide receiver with upside. And you look at Allen Robinson last year, like, all he was a young wide receiver with upside, and now he's, a top 5, top 10 Dynasty asset.
Right.
but there are a lot. If you look at supply and demand, there is a huge supply of them. And if you get rid of one young wide receiver with upside, it's pretty easy to get your hands on another, just even off of waivers. I think it's one of the few assets that you can routinely get off of waivers that will actually gain dynasty value.
Well, and how many? Here's the other thing: is wide receivers they're longer lasting. I think compared to running back, that position, that opportunity churns less on a week to week and season to season basis. So that means how many jobs are open? Yes, there's two or three on the field. There's more than running backs in terms of snaps available, but yet how many are truly open? To a riser, one of these, as you said, young with upside. How many are truly being groomed, or the perception is there that if they do X, Y, and Z, that's it. They're our core go-to wide receiver, and now as a fantasy owner, you can count on them. You can count on me. You can count on this team. And that's why I've been shifting. I mean, I used to be to my detriment. Oh yeah, roster all these nice, round 3, round 4 NFL wide receivers, upside and these traits, but yet you have 10 of them on a roster, and the last 4 or 5, how meaningful are they? And it's almost like the more data digging I do, that second half of a dynasty startup draft, wide receiver is not the position that
Yeah.
pays. It's
Yeah.
everything else. I mean, heck, if you a shoe quarterback, right? And there's some nice gravy, production or otherwise, for quarterbacks, tight ends, especially, and running backs. I mean, we know, just take your role, right? Take 5, 6 of them, because the odds that all of them roll snake eyes is very low.
Yeah, and I think in general, quarterbacks and tight ends tend to be a little bit undervalued in Dynasty. Not even necessarily because they're going to have the career longevity, but just because there's been so much focus on running backs and wide receivers because of the scarcity that I think people lose sight of the fact that a productive tight end is putting points in your lineup too. Somebody like Delaney Walker, he's gotten you some wins over the last couple seasons.
Right. So let's go. So I made this list, just a crude running list of the distressed in some capacity players. So these are players I wanted to get your opinion on. Number one, do they fit your criteria of the talent's high enough to consider them truly, an oscillating asset that is worth playing the market in some degree, or trying to time things? And then just sort of your thoughts going forward. So let's start with the most distressed and most recent, I'll say, is Carlos Williams. So someone that had a historically pretty, for his draft pedigree, that was a very strong rookie season, positional convert, had some traits that are desirable playing on the inside with his natural size, but now he's on the outs, suspended, without a team. Is he someone that he's dropped in your dynasty league? Are you interested? Is he talented enough to be considered distressed and desirable to you?
It's really going to depend on how big rosters are. I'm not rushing out.
25 man rosters.
25, 12 team
Hyperactive
league
type. Yeah.
with kickers and defenses.
It's that close. It's that close for Adam.
No, yeah. I'm not super excited to run out and get him. The fact that he cleared waivers to me is a big red sign, because again, there's very few opportunities for you to cheat off the NFL's homework, and where they'll just.
Well, he's like 20 pounds overweight, right? I mean, who's going to pick him up today? I mean, they're going to wait for him.
Very few times where a team will just flat out tell you, this is what we think about a player when they hit free agency.
Waivers, did he not?
Huh?
Did Kristen Michael clear waivers? I can't remember. Last year.
He did. Yeah, he was on. I think he was on a practice squad at some point, but. But I mean, again, that's the Rocky story. Like, for every underdog who makes good, there's 99 who get squashed like a bug.
Never hear from a Carlos Williams again.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
So yeah, I think the draft, and then free agency, and then something like waivers. Those are really the only times where the league is just telling you, like, this is, as a collective whole, this is what we think of this player. And I think when they tell you that, you should listen.
Okay. Next guy, Josh Gordon. So talk about a player that was a Comet, number 1 overall dynasty player for his offseason after the giant breakout campaign. A lot of moving pieces since, and I kind of think, people thinking he's going to just walk in and dominate targets. This is a much different set of weapons. It's kind of why I'm against Gary Barnidge at what he costs today for 2016 as well. Josh Gordon, Is the juice worth the squeeze? And what do you think he's going to do within the construct of all those added weapons now, if he does get all the way back, staying clean and nice?
I think you mentioned timing the market before the segment, and I could go on a rant about I don't really believe in buying low and selling high just because I think actually timing the market properly is one of the hardest things to pull off. And so I tend to be more of I call myself a Warren Buffett style value investor where I'm just buying the guys who I think the fundamentals are worth more than the cost. And so it's kind of led to some interesting moments on Josh Gordon. You mentioned he was the number one overall dynasty asset for like 6 months before he got that big suspension. Um, and I took a lot of heat because I think I had him fringe first rounder and definitely outside of that top tier of wide receivers just because of the suspension risk.
Well, can we hit a pause? Because what you just said, I think, is a key point for people that look at rankings and people that hoot and holler. Once you rank a guy kind of below that confidence curve of where he typically goes, it doesn't matter if you have him so Josh Gordon in that moment. You said you had him as late first. You could have had him in the 5th round. It honestly doesn't matter because
it
all
means
you're
not
saying
going to
is,
have him.
I wouldn't take him. And if you're asking me questions, generally the response is going to be, I wouldn't recommend the move or the pick to get player X.
Right. So and I kind of got a reputation as being way below consensus on Josh Gordon. And then after like 2 or 3 more suspensions, I'm looking at the rankings and I'm like, wait a minute, am I the highest guy on Josh Gordon now? How did that happen? And
everyone puts him as an undrafted, put him on the waiver wire guy.
Right.
Like, well, I still got him at 150 or something.
Yeah. So it's funny. You mentioned inertia earlier, and I say my rankings tend to be pretty inert. Unless it's a player where I really have no knowledge whatsoever, where there's just no information behind the ranking, then they can do some pretty wild swings. But once we pretty much know what a guy is, he's not going to be shooting up or down too much. And so if the consensus starts yo-yoing him, I can easily wind up going from the lowest to the highest.
Did you think Gordon, when he hadn't been reinstated yet and he moved up, I saw him consistently in the 20 to 25 startup area. Is that the risk tolerance of, could he be back to the first round? Certainly, but there's a lot of risk here. Where did you fall in that line when he was there earlier?
Oh, I was below him there. So it's funny. I went from like the lowest on Josh Gordon to the highest on Josh Gordon back to the lowest, and I'm like, I haven't moved. I'm in the same place.
I think if you're less emotional, I think you're probably going to be less. You just kind of stay near the middle of the road. Mm-hmm. You oscillate a little bit, a few degrees from center, but not really. Okay. So as of today, though, I mean, so what do you think about that situation, though? Can RG3 resurrect things? Corey Coleman. I mean, there's a lot of moving pieces in that passing game that was, I think, one of the 2 worst in the league by the statistical measures last year.
And I think you raise a good point about Josh Gordon's risk. People see, Josh Gordon is a suspension risk, and obviously he is. There's really no question about that.
They see binary. They see he's going to be either 20 points per game or he's going to be out of the league. Right,
and I was building a timeline the other day, and I think he's had like 12 drug-related incidents since he entered college at Baylor.
Discussion, right, of getting Adam talking about relapses and probabilities of suspensions, and
So I think this last time before this last failed test was the longest he'd ever gone between a drug-related incident, and that was like 14 months. So there's obviously a lot of suspension risk there still. I saw a tweet. Somebody said he hasn't gone a year without failing a drug test since he was in 7th grade because he was getting drug tested in Pop Warner or whatever, like the high school.
Drug tested in Pop Warner.
Yeah, I don't know. So I don't know how credible.
I was surprised though. I saw a stat on Twitter. Can't credit the person. I can't remember, but just that a lot of basically the recurrence rate from say stage 1 or level 1 to level 2. I mean, it wasn't very high, but then once you get deeper into the program, the recurrence rate gets so high. But that's probably because, this becomes chronic. You're going to get tested. It's the people that pop at the combine, right? It's coming, but it's such a habit in your life that you just can't get it out for whatever the motivation.
And this is actually a very fitting topic because I just published an article on this yesterday with Le'Veon Bell. So how the drug program is set up. It's not set up to catch people who do drugs. And just flat out it's not. And I know this because if you ask any former NFL player, you say, what percentage of the league is smoking marijuana? And like Scott Fujita, Lomas Brown, Ricky Williams, there's been dozens of NFL players who've weighed in, and the estimate is always somewhere between 30% and 70%. There was a GM.
At 30 to 70% don't get suspended.
Right, yeah. There was a GM who weighed in, and he's like, yeah, if you look at the combine, I think like 40% of prospects at the combine had either tested positive at the combine or had a college positive test on their record. And he's like, that's totally in line with league averages. That's about half the league. Half the league right now is smoking pot. And the reason they don't get suspended is because the program is set up. You get tested once a year, and it comes during a 4-month window. But to save costs, realistically, the test comes at the beginning of training camp, where everybody's in the same place and they can just knock them all out at once. So it's really an IQ test. Don't smoke pot for 6 weeks before training camp, and you won't get tested. And then once you get your one test, there are 0 more tests coming for 12 months.
Right.
You can smoke
unless you're higher up in the program, correct?
Exactly. And so it's not meant to catch people who do drugs. It's meant to catch people who can't stop doing drugs when they know it's coming.
Do it all off season, but are you smart enough to stop when you need to stop?
So if you get in, so there's a lot of people who enter stage 1 of the program either because the test didn't come at training camp and it caught them by surprise, or because something else happened. Le'Veon Bell got busted for DUI and the car was filled with smoke. And so then they get into stage 1 like that. And then once you're in stage 1, it lasts for 2 years. You know you're going to be getting tested all the time. And so you just say, all right, it sucks. I'm just going to quit for 2 years, and then I'm out of the program. And you can go back to, it's like you were never in the first place. So the vast majority of the people who get into stage 1 are people who can quit anytime they want to. They just don't need to quit because they know they're not going to get tested. But then they start getting tested and they're like, all right, so I'm going to quit. And then once you start failing tests once you're in the program, that says, I know I'm going to be getting tested 10 times a month, up to 10 times a month. You're not beating that test. You're getting tested so much that you can't smoke marijuana anymore. And so if you start failing tests in the program, then you're to the point where, all right, you've known this was coming and you failed, because you have to fail at least 3 tests before you're actually missing games.
Yeah, I think people don't realize how deep you have to get to be in this level of caring for us that actually impacts us.
Because it's all anonymous before that. There's privacy laws, so we don't know. For all we know, Tom Brady's got 2 strikes against him, and his next strike he's missing games. We don't know.
Right. Yeah.
It could be.
Yeah.
So
they
by
let
the
us
time
know what they let us know.
Right. By the time we hear about it, that's 3 failed tests, and that's a pretty strong pattern of behavior. And so then you're like, this guy has a problem. You can quibble about whether it's an addiction problem, what it is, but this guy has a problem. And so there's a huge chance that this problem is not just magically going away overnight, because it didn't magically go away overnight after the last 2 tests. So that's a real risk.
Well, so Josh Gordon qualifies.
Absolutely. Real risk there. But Le'Veon Bell is kind of an interesting case, because Le'Veon Bell, and pretty much all parties will agree on this, Le'Veon Bell has never failed an NFL drug test. He got put into the program for getting a DUI, which, remember, half the league is smoking pot, so that's essentially bad luck. He was the guy who got busted by the cops. That could have been anyone. And then he got suspended again this year for missing tests. He claims that he changed his cell phone number and he never got the notification. Whatever, maybe the dog ate his homework, maybe it didn't. It's worth noting that he actually completed, he did an intervention program for the parole, and he completed that at the same time. So if they were drug testing him, he passed those. So it's possible that Le'Veon Bell is being honest when he says he hasn't smoked marijuana in the last 2 years, and so the possibility exists with Le'Veon Bell that he doesn't have a drug problem, and he's one of those players who can stop smoking when they need to. But with Josh Gordon, he's got a problem at this point. Which
means every step of the way, be skeptical, right?
Yes.
Be skeptical every day. It sounds like he's more and more likely to the next hammer is going to fall.
Yep.
Well, and where do you let me just ask to finish Josh Gordon. Where do you fall on this? Because I say the last time he was on the field, he wasn't even that good. And so you get a first-round pick coming in, Terrell Pryor, big wild card there. Gary Barnidge is a viable tight end. I just to think he's going to come in and, oh, please, Josh Gordon, take a prorated 125 targets on an annual basis. I think that's folly to kind of project and think that back to the binary outcome. He's going to be great or he's going to be off the field. And I kind of think he can just be back and be a wide receiver 3.
Totally.
I mean, a boom-bust weekly wide receiver 3.
Best case scenario for him would be something like Vincent Jackson, where Vincent Jackson was a monster, and then he had that year in the year where there was no CBA, and he didn't actually have a contract, and the Chargers were offering him like $500,000, and he's like, no, I'm not going to play for that and risk my big payday. Um, and so he held out for most of the year, and then he came back for the last 6 games so that he could accrue a season's worth of service and hit free agency. And he wasn't really that good in those 6 games. He was he was there. He was on the field. He showed some flashes, but he wasn't really that invested. He had missed most of the install of the offense, and he was just kind of there. And then he went to Tampa, and he's a monster again. And so I think that's the best case scenario for Josh Gordon is the last time he's on the field, he was just kind of there, but that's because he wasn't really installed in the offense yet. And this year he's going to come back and be a monster.
Final question on Gordon that I have, and so all the insight you have on the drug program. Number one, is Gordon in it forever? Where he is now, or can't? How long does he have to go and be a good boy and a good soldier before he's back to the you kind of know when you're getting tested?
So the rules are stage 3 is indefinite. There is a provision in place after 24 months since your last failed test. You can be reevaluated, and if a medical director says it's suitable, they can discharge you from stage 3, and then they reevaluate every 6 months after that. But
Meaning
that's
you
going to
would
be
drop down to stage 2,
no,
and
no, no.
another 6 months you would drop
You're,
down. Oh,
you're out of the
okay.
program entirely. Like you were never in the first place. First test
Okay.
gets you back in stage 1. But that's, I mean, again, that's not the default. That's if the medical director says he no longer presents this risk entirely.
I got you.
And
from 2 years, what is day one for Gordon? So where's the clock on the 2 years for Gordon?
whatever his last failed test was. But here's the thing,
Okay.
that's not the default. That's special circumstances if a medical director.
That's best case.
Right.
Well,
and
and you just said since 7th grade, so who's getting that?
right, exactly.
He's
And
the last one to get the special privilege.
absolutely. And
Okay.
even if he did, A, we wouldn't know about it. For all we know, he's still in stage 3 because that's private. And B, that assumes he stays clean for the 2 years in the first place. And like you said, who's going to get that? It's not going to be the guy with that many failed tests.
And the recurrence rate. And just let's put it in a dynasty. We've all had that guy where, I mean, if you want to make jokes about Darren McFadden, he gets hurt getting out of bed or whatever you want to say, but when you get a player with off-field concerns like this, a risk guy, you wake up every day and you wouldn't be surprised if it's your Twitter feed or you just see on the NFL newswire that so-and-so, I mean, if you pick 10 players in the NFL that you wouldn't be surprised at all to wake up and see that, and your guy's on that. Just to me, I'm kind of over it. I'm just kind of over going down that path of risk. And it sounds like from all your digestion of everything that feeds into this risk factor, you're generally on the lower band when people don't evaluate that to its full degree.
And yeah, and here's, I was saying that I think production follows a very power law distribution. I think having that top 5 upside, that's a big deal. I will tolerate a lot of risk to get that top 5 up.
Well, for what cost, right? I mean, you just
That's
said
exactly
Gordon
the
at
point.
25 overall. Heck
Right.
no. Which meant, but where do you have him? 50, 100? I mean,
Exactly, and when you get in that range, there's really nobody else who has that kind of upside, and it starts to make sense. But in the second, third round of startups, there's other guys who have that kind of upside. There's no need to take on that risk unnecessarily, chasing an upside that you could get elsewhere.
Well, let's bring one other player into the fold, and that's Martavis Bryant. So this is someone similar range. I remember back early in the offseason, he was in that similar 20 to 30 overall, and he was at that 2-3 turn, and one of those. He's like a baby deer. He doesn't really know what he's doing, yet he's performing at 16, 17, 18 points per game in this high-level offense. What's the Martavis Bryant off-field story, and then what's your risk tolerance for him going forward based on that?
Well, I was a little lower than consensus on him in the first place, just because I thought a lot of the ranking was about potential, and potential to me is a word for he hasn't done it yet. And who knows if he ever will. I think he was kind of being ranked, I won't say necessarily at his best case scenario, but he's maybe being ranked at like a 66th to 75th percentile outcome rather than at like the true midpoint of the full range of possibilities.
Did it bother you that Antonio Bryant in his prime was there? Does that factor in that a guy, I kind of see him as the Robin to a Batman, or do you think in special cases like a Roddy and Julio, I mean you kind of feed the beast if that's where the talent is?
Well, like I said, I'm a heuristics guy, so I'm not looking at it in that granular of a
I
level
gotcha.
where, I'm just looking at how good is he, how proven is he, what's this track record, how old is
We
he,
didn't do anything at Clemson.
and yeah, and exactly, and so historically, what's this
He was a
combination
round
been
four
worth?
pick.
And so I liked Bryant. I definitely saw the upside, but you know what I say, the most overrated asset in Dynasty is upside in a wide receiver.
Well,
It's
it sounds like you were out the moment he started hitting because you
yeah.
look at the production was abysmal in college, and then you see medium level draft pedigree of the 7 rounds, and then you see a guy, and especially now, right when he's going to miss the year, and that gives a year for a lot of other things to happen in Pittsburgh. Life passes you by, in a sense, and now what stage is he in?
He's in stage 3 now, so he's had
Stage
at least 3
right.
positive tests plus whatever in college.
Stage 3. So
So,
there you go. And
and
is he right there on the same level as Josh Gordon for you, or it doesn't really matter? Stage 3 is stage 3.
in terms of risk,
Yeah,
he's
that
lower risk. He's lower risk than Gordon just because he's had fewer fail. Although I don't know, I'd say it's about the same. I think once you're failing, 3, 4, 5 tests,
well,
I
now it
think
becomes you have to quit
right.
because you're tested so often, or at least
Right.
you know
And
that's
I
on.
guess, are you more likely to quit after your 3rd failed test than your 5th or your 8th? Or I don't really
Right.
know. I mean, I think at that point, and the literature on, again, addiction is always a loaded term to use, but the literature is, somebody with an addiction problem, they have about a 50-50 shot of staying clean a year after rehab. It's not great odds. It's kind of grim. I'm not burying them entirely because 50% is still 50%. There's a good chance. But yeah, risk-wise, I think they're pretty similar. I don't think he quite has the upside or talent of Gordon. And like you said, with a year off, who knows what happens? Who knows if he's the same player when he comes back?
I gotcha. Final thoughts. We got 3, 4, 5 minutes left of the show. Is there any player that, whether it's the preseason or you've seen the dynasty marketplace moving now a lot more since the NFL draft pause? I would say we've had that to digest. Is there any player that either moving up, moving down, that you just have your eye on, that you've been accumulating shares, maybe selling a few, critical players for your rosters in general for this year?
I don't know. I tend to not. I don't really focus on specific players. There are some guys who I own pretty much everywhere. A lot of times it happens by chance, not because I'm necessarily focusing. I'm usually just feeling out my league mates, and I will gladly buy or sell anyone if the price is right. Like I said, I view myself as a Warren Buffett value investor, where this is what I think a guy's worth. If he costs less than that, I'm buying. If he costs more than that, I'm selling.
Okay. So no.
Nope.
I love that. All right. Well, open avenue here. So footballguys.com. What are you doing over there? Your new podcast. Where can they listen? What is it? And where can they find you on Twitter?
So footballguys.com, I am doing player upside projections and returner projections, both of which are incorporated into the Football Guys Draft Dominator app for PC, Mac, iPhone, Android, pretty much everything. And then I'm getting back into the writing. I haven't been as much recently. I've kind of been swamped, but I'm getting back into the writing. I'll be doing a couple weekly columns this year. Podcast is Fantasy Football in Theory. It's the podcast that's theoretically about fantasy football. And you can find it on iTunes or Stitcher. And then you can catch me anytime on Twitter at Adam Harstad. That's Harstad.
Great. I'm on Twitter at Chad Parsons NFL. As I mentioned at the top, Under the Helmet podcast comes out Tuesday night, Wednesday morning on iTunes and Podbean, Stitcher, all those avenues. And uthdynasty.com. You want my rankings, trade calculator, all those good things. And you can try out 150 plus, probably going to be close to 200 premium shows by the end of the calendar year here. Strictly for Dynasty, also putting out some film notes on a weekly basis to catch you up on what you may have missed watching every play of every game. So you can find that through the FanDuel promotion at fanduel.com/underthehelmet, or you can go and sign up at uthdynasty.com. Wanted to remind you about this great series Slurv has going on, your chance to interact with experts on a weekly basis, guys like Evan Silvas, Davis Maddock, as mentioned at the top of the hour, 4 o'clock Eastern here on Friday. After this show, Adam Levitan, Chris Raybon are going to be up. FanDuel's 2015 Fantasy Football World Champ Roman Edmond, many more experts, so check the slurv.com schedule for all of these great chats. And that's going to do it for this week. Thanks to Adam for coming and joining me. I am Chad Parsons, and until next time, never settle, refuse to be average, and keep building those dynasties.